The Secretary of Defense is holding church. Not at a chapel, not on a Sunday, not off the clock. Pete Hegseth is running monthly Christian worship services in the main auditorium of the Pentagon during work hours while the United States is at war with Iran. The services get streamed live on the Pentagon's internal television network. Invitations go out as all-hands emails from the Secretary's office, sometimes stamped with a Department of War seal, because rebranding your department is a thing you do when you're normal and having a great time. Hundreds of Pentagon staff pack the room to standing. Defense contractors get personal invites, and the preachers are handpicked by Hegseth. Franklin Graham, Doug Wilson, a Christian Reconstructionalist who has argued that the American South got a lot of things right, and his personal pastor from Tennessee flown in for the occasion. These are sermons inside the nerve center of American military power during a war on the taxpayer's clock, and multiple reports describe those in the audience as being effectively voluntold to attend because the secretary was hosting it. But the services aren't even the part that you should be paying attention to. On March 9th, 2026, Hegseth walks up to the Pentagon briefing podium. Pentagon seal behind him, cameras rolling. He's delivering an operational update on the US's strikes against Iran. Routine stuff, logistics and targeting. And then, to close it out, the Secretary of Defense opens his Bible and reads Psalm 144. Blessed be the Lord, my God, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. In a defense briefing, that's a psalm about God training you to kill from the podium of the largest military apparatus on Earth during a war. If you pitch this in a writer's room, somebody would say that we need to ground it more, and the room would nod. This is the kind of thing that, if it happened in Iran, the Pentagon would cite as evidence of theocratic extremism. But we're fine. We're normal. And the psalm was the restrained version. At the first worship service after the Iran strikes began, Hegseth led a prayer asking God for, quote, overwhelming violence against American enemies. He prayed that every round find its mark. He asked for no mercy against those who deserve none. He quoted conquest psalms about pursuing enemies, consuming them, destroying those who hate him, all in Jesus' name, all on camera, all inside the Pentagon. In a CBS interview, he told reporters that the providence of our almighty God is safeguarding those troops. At a press conference, he ironically referred to Iranian leaders as, quote, religious extremists hell-bent on prophetic Islamic delusions, who wanted nuclear weapons for, quote, religious Armageddon. NPR's analysts called his rhetoric completely and totally unprecedented for a sitting defense secretary, which is Access journalist for holy shit, nothing like this has ever happened in modern military history. And in case you're wondering whether this is contained to the briefing room, on Good Friday, 2026, Pentagon staff received an internal email from Air Force leadership. It read, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly, friendly reminder, there will be a Protestant service, no Catholic Mass, for Good Friday today at the Pentagon Chapel. The Pentagon's Interfaith Chapel, on one of the holiest days in the Christian calendar, said that it was not going to have any Catholic observance offered. Catholic employees speaking anonymously said that the message was clear, that, their kind was not welcome. Now, your instinct here is probably to ask, does he actually believe in all of this? And my citation would be his fucking body. He has Deus Vult tattooed on one of his biceps in Latin. Again, in stark irony of his anti-Catholic move, that's the battle cry of the First Crusade in 1095. He also has a Jerusalem cross spanning across his chest, the heraldic emblem of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Army's own extremism screening has flagged Deus Vult as a slogan used by white supremacists and far-right paramilitary networks. Hegseth wears it on his skin and wrote a book called American Crusade. He calls himself a modern crusader. His department posts official videos overlaying Bible verses onto footage of troops and weapon systems. He is extremely not hiding. So when the Secretary of Defense prays for overwhelming violence from the Pentagon podium during a war, when he frames the conflict as Christianity versus Islam, when he literally tattoos Crusader iconography on his body and publishes a book about it, The question everyone reaches for is this man insane? And the answer is yes, but it's the wrong question. The question that this video is going to answer is what built him? Because I'll be honest with you, what I see when I look at Pete Hegseth is barely concealed white supremacist fascism wearing a cross. And I'm genuinely shocked at how few people treat it that way. But Pete Hegseth didn't come from nowhere. He's a product, and the machine that manufactured him has been running for 50 years. Most people have never seen this machine, but by the end of this video, you will. Okay, so that's terrifying, I know. Let's do a deep breathing exercise real fast. We're gonna be okay. Before you build Pete Hegseth into a 10-foot tall warlord in your head, let's actually look at him a little bit, because here is the resume of the man running the largest military on Earth, again, during a war. He's a part-time National Guard officer who topped out at the rank of major. His longest contribution stint in uniform was about 3 years. Between deployment, he worked at Bear Stearns and ran a couple of Koch-funded veterans nonprofits, one of which pushed him out over financial mismanagement. He lost a Republican Senate primary in Minnesota, and then landed a couch on Fox and Friends weekend. That's his career arc. Princeton ROTC to Gable News to the Pentagon. He has never commanded a brigade. He has never run a logistics chain. He has never sat in a war college seminar. He got his job because Donald Trump watched him on television and liked how angry he sounded at breakfast. His most consequential leadership decision before 2025 was choosing which end of a couch to sit on during a morning show. The man's career trajectory is a straight line from guy who buys tactical wet wipes to Secretary of War. And the fact that he could look angry was his whole thing. Fox didn't hire him as a military analyst, they hired him as a culture war surrogate who happened to own combat boots. His job was to yell about woke generals and defend the accused war criminals on camera while looking appropriately muscular. A Fox producer who later became his third wife reportedly kept putting him on air, giving him more segments than his seniority warranted. The network needed a guy who looked like a soldier, talked like a preacher, and never questioned the premise. Pete Hegseth was perfect for that. He once tried to do a macho axe-throwing bit on live TV where he missed the target and hit a West Point drummer in the arm. And the drummer sued. That's just 3 sentences summing up his career at Fox. This man has a trajectory. But that is your secretary, and I need you to hear the quotation marks around this, war. He wrote an embarrassing tome called American Crusade. The book reads like a very long Facebook post about how leftists and Muslims are destroying Western civilization, and real Americans need to arm themselves for a holy war. He insists it's not about literal swords, and our fight is not with guns, yet. Which is a hell of a sentence to publish when you're angling for a government job. Again, he has Deus Vult tattooed on his body, the battle cry of the First Crusade, a phrase the Army's own extremism screening flagged as a white supremacist indicator. In 2021, a National Guard security manager filed an insider threat warning on Hegseth himself during inauguration duty, partly because of that tattoo, partly because of his politics. He was deemed too politically dangerous to stand near the Capitol. And 4 years later, he's signing promotion lists inside it. And about those promotion lists, earlier this month, we learned that Hegseth personally pulled 4 names off a brigadier general's slate of about 3 dozen officers. The 4 he yanked were 2 black men and 2 women. The defense secretary is supposed to approve or reject those lists as a whole, specifically to prevent this kind of targeted bigotry. When the Army Secretary refused to strip the names out, Hegseth did it himself. One of the black officers had apparently committed the sin of writing about how black officers get funneled into support roles instead of combat ones. One of the women had served during the Afghanistan withdrawal. His public justification was restoring meritocracy, a very funny statement given his career. Before that, he pushed out the first woman to lead the Naval Academy, the Coast Guard Commandant, the Chief of Naval Operations, the US military rep to the NATO Military Committee, all of whom had one thing in common: being women. and they were all replaced with white men. When the dust settled, for the first time in years, there were 0 women 4-star officers in a force where roughly 20% of the troops are female and about 43% are people of color. 5 members of the Joint Chiefs gone in a single year, with only 2 holdovers. The people inside the Pentagon, and I mean uniformed people who normally don't talk to press, have been leaking to reporters that he is, quote, hated. His own front office devolved into shouting matches and mutual accusations of leaking. 3 aides got marched out in a leak investigation, then immediately started leaking about being marched out. It is an incredibly stable situation over there at the Pentagon. This is what control looks like from the inside. A building full of professionals quietly trying to limit the damage being done by a man that they clearly do not respect. Meanwhile, whistleblowers at his veterans nonprofit describe him getting completely shit-faced at Memorial Day events, throwing up in bushes, getting carried back to his hotel room, then waking up the next morning to give a patriotic speech as the face of the tour. At one event, he reportedly passed out on a couch, slumped over a young female staffer until 2 guys peeled him off and got him to bed. Then, he caught his flight to the next rally. He's on his 3rd marriage. The affair that precedented the current one was with the Fox producer who kept boosting his airtime. So this is the Christian warrior who's defending the family and the West. His detractors call him Hegseth, which is the kind of nickname you earn exactly once and then can never escape. Kind of like when I was in high school, and I kid you not, my nickname, with one circle of friends anyway, was Poogie, because Pudgy and Noogie. For the chess club, this was particularly unsophisticated. Anyways, where I come from, asking somebody their religion is actually kind of rude. It's private. And I'm also completely unaccustomed to the idea that someone would not only believe a set of supernatural claims, but somehow feel entitled to impose them on strangers through federal policy. This gap is probably one of the biggest differences between Canadian and American culture, and people who say our cultures are basically the same have definitely never sat in a room where someone explains why God needs them to control a school board. I'm telling you all this for a specific reason, and it's not just to dunk on him. I mean, it's a little bit to dunk on him, but the actual point is more important. Pete Hegseth is not some kind of mastermind. He's, if anything, a middle manager. Everything he's doing at the Pentagon, every purge, every restructuring, he didn't invent any of it. He's executing a manual. The Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 called for cutting generals by 10%. Hegseth is cutting generals. Project 2025 called for consolidating the military's independent legal officers, the JAG Corps, to remove the internal check on unlawful orders. Hegseth fired the top JAGs of the Army, Navy, and Air Force in one Friday night news dump. Project 2025 called for replacing career civil servants with ideological loyalists. Hegseth issued a memo ordering a cultural refresh of the Pentagon workforce and directed the watchdog office to use AI to speed up investigations and removals. This man is a sock puppet with biceps and good hair. Same job description at Fox, just with a bigger desk. He's reading from a script that somebody else wrote. And the people who wrote that script picked him specifically because he looks like a soldier on television and doesn't ask uncomfortable questions about what he's told to sign. Which means Peg Hegseth resigned tomorrow, got fired, got bored, wandered off to launch a bourbon brand with a Crusader cross on the label. Nothing changes. The machine that produced him would still be running. The donor networks, the legal pipelines, the media ecosystem that trained him, their Heritage Foundation staffing database that supplied all of his deputies, all of it is still going to be humming along looking for the next guy. So the question this video is actually about isn't whether Pete Hegseth is crazy or whether he's dangerous. The question is, what built him? Who designed the machine? How long has it been running? And can you take it apart? Because the machine has a name and a structure, and I can show it to you. So, Pete Hegseth, weird guy, dangerous, sure, but we just established something important. He is a product. He is the output of a system that's been running longer than he's been on television, which means the interesting question has changed. It's no longer, what's wrong with this fucking guy? It's, what does the machine that made him actually look like? And this is where most people hit a wall. Because when you hear Christian nationalism, your brain probably does one of two things. Either you picture a megachurch pastor screaming about the end times, or you picture your aunt who just thinks America should be more Christian and doesn't see why that's a problem. Both of those images are wrong. Or I guess I should say they're incomplete in a way that's almost worse than being wrong, because they let you think you understand something that you don't. Christian nationalism isn't a church. It's not a denomination. There's no membership card, there's no CEO, no headquarters with a sign that says Christian Nationalism Incorporated, undermining pluralism since 1971. It's more like stack. And I should be upfront about something. I didn't grow up in this. I'm not an ex-evangelical. I'm not somebody who escaped a fundamentalist household. Some of you watching this are, and you know things about this world that I never will from the inside. My authority here is structural analysis, not testimony. I can show you how the machine works, but I can't tell you what it feels like to be inside it. So picture a block tower with 5 layers, each one of them doing a completely different job. The whole thing only working because they're stacked on top of each other. You know, I spent 3 weeks trying to find a better metaphor than stack. I tried pipeline, I tried ecosystem, I tried unholy Rube Goldberg machine, but stack is what stuck. It's not going to win me a Pulitzer, but it's load bearing. At the bottom, there are donors, rich families and dark money trusts who fund the operation. One layer up, you have legal networks, firms like the Alliance Defending Freedom that manufacture court cases the way a factory makes car parts, hundreds at a time on a production line specifically engineered to land at the Supreme Court. Above that, media. And I don't mean Fox. I mean Fox plus an entire parallel information ecosystem that keeps the base locked in a permanent loop of threat and outrage. And then party infrastructure, committees, candidate pipelines, voter databases, get out the vote operations run on churches on Sunday mornings. And at the top, the most visible layer, the churches themselves and the mass base that they represent. So donors, legal, media, party, churches. That is the stack. And each layer needs the others. The donors fund the legal shops. The legal shops win cases that rewrite the rules. The media tells 40 million people those rule changes are God's will. The party converts that energy into votes and staffing pipelines, and the churches provide the warm bodies, the moral urgency, and, this part matters, the tax-exempt real estate to run the whole operation out of. And now, here's the part that makes the thing genuinely hard to fight. Nobody runs it. There is no secret room where Leonard Leo and Franklin Graham and the Heritage Foundation staffers sit at a table drawing up the master plan. They don't need to. The stack is self-organizing. Each layer does its job because doing its job is how it gets funded, how it stays relevant, and how it wins. The incentives are structural. You don't need a conspiracy when you have aligned interests. And you might already be thinking, sure, but isn't this just how politics works? Don't all movements have donors and lawyers and media? Yes. Every political coalition has some version of these pieces, but what makes this stack different, what makes it worth spending however long this video is going to be of your finite time on this planet, is 2 things. First, the integration. Most coalitions are messy alliances of groups that roughly agree on some stuff. This stack is engineered. The legal strategies are specifically designed to create precedents the executive branch can exploit. The media messaging is calibrated to press the base for those legal strategies before they even hit the courtroom. The donor money flows through networks built to avoid disclosure. Call it a coalition if you want, but coalitions argue about strategy at conferences and fall apart over disagreements. This thing is a pipeline. Every section of the pipe knows what it's carrying and where it's going. And second is the fuel. A pipeline needs something to push through it, and the fuel this machine runs on is belief. Sincere, genuine religious belief. Millions of people who love God and love their country and is being told every single Sunday that both are under attack. That is the energy source of this group. That's what makes this thing more powerful than a PAC or a think tank or a campaign ad. You cannot purchase that at any price point. You need people who believe their eternal damnation is a line item on the federal budget. So, the theological part is real. It genuinely motivates people. But the infrastructure that harnesses that motivation, that turns Sunday morning into a policy outcome by Thursday, that part was built by professionals who understand power a lot better than they understand scripture. Okay, that's a stack, 5 layers. I'm going to walk you through each one, bottom to top, and show you what it looks like when you crack it open. Before we start the tour, hold one question in the back of your mind. A machine this size requires an enormous amount of human energy to keep running. Millions of people plugged in, giving money, giving time, giving votes, giving their kids Sunday mornings. As we walk through these layers, keep asking, who is actually powering this? How many people are we talking about? Because when we finish the tour, I'm going to show you the hard numbers. And the data doesn't just tell you how big this movement is, it tells you what the people inside it are actually willing to do to keep it running. Every system has a floor, the layer everything else sits on. And for the Christian nationalist stack, that floor is money. Specifically, a very small number of very rich people who figured out that funding God is one of the best investments in American politics. So I want to introduce you to a building. Well, I want to introduce you to a UPS store in Utah, because that is the listed headquarters of the Marble Freedom Trust, which at the time of this recording controls over $1 billion in political assets and has no public website, no visible staff, and no explanation of what it does. Its phone number belongs to a guy named Neil Corky, a longtime operative in Leonard Leo's anti-abortion network. The number predates the trust itself. $1 billion political operation run through a mailbox in a strip mall. That is where the bottom of this whole stack lives. So now, let's talk about old Lenny. Leo is not a politician. He's not a preacher. He's not on cable news. For most of the last 30 years, he's been the executive vice president of the Federalist Society, which sounds like one of those boring legal organizations that sends you junk mail, until you realize that it is the organization that handpicked 6 of the current 9 Supreme Court justices. And just so you know, yes, it is the bad ones. But Leo's Federalist Society role was really more like a day job. His actual project, the one he's been building since the mid-2010s, is a financial machine so opaque that reporters have spent years trying to map it. So here's how the machine got its fuel. There's a guy named Bar Seed. Bar Seed, yeah, let's go with that. He's a Chicago businessman and made his fortune selling Trip Light surge protectors and power strips. You know, the little beige power strips that are in every office that are plugged into the PCs during the 90s? So former colleagues would say that Seed was so obsessive that he'd go through the entire Trip Light catalog with a pen and personally adjust the pricing on individual surge protectors instead of delegating. If you own a power strip, there is a non-zero chance that Bar Seed personally decided what you paid for it, and then used the profit to end the separation of church and state. He was also obsessively private. He doesn't do interviews, he wants to be invisible. In 2020, though, Seed did something that made him extremely visible, although it took 2 years for anybody to find out. He transferred 100% of his ownership of Trip Light into Leo's Marble Freedom Trust. Not a donation, not a check. He gave him the entire company. And then in March of 2021, the Irish conglomerate Eaton Corporation bought Trip Light from the trust for about $1.63 billion. And because Seed donated the stock before the sale, the whole transaction landed inside a tax-exempt trust. The sale was completely tax-free. Analysts estimate that Seed saved about $400 million in capital gains taxes. That money, which would have gone to the IRS, instead became a permanent political endowment controlled by one man, Leonard Leo. And the paper trail for this is almost funny. In Trip Light's 2021 corporate filing with Illinois, Seed's typewritten name as a company officer is literally crossed out on the form with a pen, and Leonard Leo's name is handwritten beside it. That's the paper record of the largest known political advocacy donation in American history. So the guy who micromanaged to the point where he was pricing individual surge protectors ended up micromanaging the largest dark money gift in US history. And by August of 2022, when the New York Times and ProPublica broke the story, Leo was sitting on a war chest that dwarfed anything that the Kochs or that the Republican National Committee could deploy from any single source. Here's the part that should bother you more than the amount. It's how the money moves once it's inside. So picture it like this. Money enters at the top through Marble Freedom Trust. The trust then writes these enormous checks to a cluster of nonprofits that Leo either chairs, controls, or has heavy influence. They have names like the 85 Fund, the Concord Fund, you might know them as the Judicial Crisis Network, or the Rule of Law Trust. So one year, the Marble Freedom Trust sent $153 million to the Rule of Law Trust alone. Another $153 million to a Schwab donor advised account. And tens of millions more went to Donors Trust, which is basically a giant anonymizing ATM for conservative money. It takes its donations, scrubs the names off of them, and then sends the money back out to wherever the donors want them to go. Those intermediary nonprofits then do two things. One, they fund the actual cause work. Grants to litigation groups that are filing cases designed to reach the Supreme Court, or 8-figure ad campaigns for judicial nominees. They're bankrolling the policy shops that wrote Project 2025, the political output that actually changes your life. And second, and this is the part that made even the jaded campaign finance reporters do a double take, those same nonprofits cut massive checks back to Leonard Leo's for-profit companies, a firm called CRC Advisors, which Leo took over in 2020, and which does vaguely described consulting and public affairs. And before that, an outfit called BH Group. Between 2016 and 2022, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington crunched the nonprofit tax filings and found that conservative nonprofits have paid over $102 million to businesses that Leo controls. About 90 million of that came from nonprofits directly tied to him. An updated analysis, taking it through 2023, pushed the total past $135 million. CRC Advisors alone pulled in over $33 million in a single year, and nearly 80% of that came from Leo-affiliated organizations. When reporters asked CRC Advisors to explain what services they actually performed to tens of millions in fees, CRC declined to specify. Leo's side didn't answer detailed questions either. Meanwhile, Leo pays himself $400,000 a year from the Marble Freedom Trust for what the trust's own filings describe as 25 hours of work a week. He also reports hours for other entities, so the man sitting on $1 billion political endowment has structured his compensation as a part-time job, which pays $16,000 per hour. So pause for a second, because I've now said the words Marble Freedom Trust, Rule of Law Trust, Concord Fund, Donors Fund, 85 Fund, and CRC Advisors in a state of about 4 minutes. So if you've lost track, congratulations, that's the point. Naming conventions are explicitly designed so that your eyes will glaze over before you can follow where the money's going. Some conservative operatives have told reporters that hiring CRC Advisors is not really optional. It functions as a toll gate. If you want access to Leo's massive donor pool and dark money network, you go through his firm, you pay his company for consulting, and then you get access to the bigger pool of money. The nonprofits that Leo influences are paying the company that Leo profits from, and the pipeline just keeps cycling. Now, Leo isn't the only money in this ecosystem. Koch-aligned foundations fund many of the same legal and policy groups. Ultra-wealthy evangelical families like the Greens, who own Hobby Lobby, the DeVos and the Prince families, and the Bradley Foundation all feed into overlapping organizations through anonymizing hubs like Donors Trust and the Heritage Foundation, which leads Project 2025 and sits right inside this funding web. Leo-aligned nonprofits have routed millions to groups like Project 2025's advisory board, including the Heritage Foundation itself. These are not separate ecosystems running in parallel, but wired into the same grid. Koch money and Leo money and evangelical money all flow through the same donor-advised funds and land in the same litigation shops. They land in the same think tanks and the same staffing pipelines. The same billionaires who want to gut labor protections and kill environmental regulations are also funding religious legal groups that challenge LGBTQ+ rights. Theology, it turns out, is very good at getting people to vote against their own economic interests while feeling righteous about it. So that's the donor layer. One guy controls a $1 billion mailbox in Utah and takes a cut from every dollar that flows through it. The network he built finances everything that we're about to walk through in the next 4 layers. The legal army, the policy blueprint, and the staffing pipeline. So now you've seen the money, you know who controls it and what he pays himself for the privilege. So now let me show you what he buys with it. The first thing the money buys is lawyers. Lots of them. And the lawyers have a whole factory of their own. The Alliance Defending Freedom pulls in about $100 million a year. It has roughly 3,000 trained law students in its alumni network and a Supreme Court win record that would make a Fortune 500 general counsel nervous. 15 wins, 80 plus cases where they showed up as a party or filed briefs. They called themselves the world's largest organization devoted to religious freedom, which is technically accurate in the same way that a weapons manufacturer would call itself the world's largest organization devoted to metallurgy. But ADF's real product isn't legal representation. Their product is plaintiffs. So here's how the factory works. These people don't wait around for a Christian baker to get sued. They go find the baker. They scout through church networks, conservative legal circles, allied advocacy groups looking for a very specific type of person. Small business owners, therapists, web designers, parents, people who fit a sympathetic archetype. Once they find the right plaintiff, they don't wait for something bad to happen to that person. They file the lawsuit before anything happens at all. This is called a pre-enforcement challenge. You sue the government before the law has even applied to you, before you've been fined, before even a single gay couple has walked into your shop. You argue that the mere existence of an anti-discrimination law chills your constitutional rights. And if a court agrees, you get to skip the messy part where a real person gets discriminated against and the public gets to see what that looks like. You litigate a hypothetical instead. Now let me show you what that looks like in practice. Lori Smith is a web designer in Colorado. In 2016, ADF helped her file a lawsuit arguing that Colorado's anti-discrimination law violated her First Amendment rights because she wanted to start making wedding websites, but didn't want to make them for gay couples. She had never made a wedding website before. She had never been asked to make a wedding website before. She had never turned anyone down. She was suing for the right to post a refusal notice before she'd entered the market. In her legal findings, Smith included a sworn declaration about a supposed request from a man named Stewart who wanted a same-sex wedding website. The request from her contact form read, and I'm doing my best with the original formatting here, "Are getting early next and would design work for our plaque, etc. We might also stretch to a website." That's the sworn evidence. Grammatically, it's incoherent. That was submitted to an actual federal court. Reporters tracked down the real Stewart, and first of all, he was straight. He was married to a woman, and he also was himself a professional web designer. So this supposed gay groom who desperately needed a wedding website builds websites for a living. He had no idea how his name ended up in the case at all. Justice Sotomayor's dissent pointed out that Smith's company had never sold a wedding website to anyone, not to a straight couple, not to a gay couple. The product didn't exist. So let me make sure I have everything right. The precedent that expanded religious exemptions to anti-discrimination law nationwide was built on a product that didn't exist, requested by a person who didn't want it, described in language that doesn't parse, to discriminate against a class of people that person doesn't even belong to. This is the legal equivalent of getting a speeding ticket for a car that you haven't purchased yet on a road that has not yet been built. And yet, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in her favor. Guess exactly who those were. Gorsuch wrote the majority opinion, holding that the First Amendment bars Colorado from forcing a designer to create, quote, expressive designs speaking messages with which the designer disagrees. The fact the request was fake, according to the Supreme Court, had no bearing on the outcome. A landmark First Amendment precedent built on a hypothetical inside a hypothetical, a speculation turducken. And that's just one case. The factory runs many of these all around the country all the time. Jack Phillips, a Colorado baker from Masterpiece Cake Shop, has been in continuous litigation for over 12 years across 3 lawsuits. The day the Supreme Court announced it would hear his first case, a transgender woman named Autumn Scardina called his bakery and requested a pink cake with blue frosting to celebrate her gender transition. Phillips initially said the design was fine, but then he learned what the occasion was and refused to do it. What followed was 5 more years of litigation, a $500 fine, appeals, and a settlement that Phillips negotiated without Scardina's participation. The most expensive $500 fine in Colorado legal history. All I have to say is that I sincerely hope that Scardina has moved on and is living her best life. But Phillips is a sideshow now. The real action has moved into schools and therapist offices. In June 2025, Mahmoud versus Taylor happened. In Montgomery County, Maryland had adopted LGBTQ inclusive storybooks for elementary schools. One of them, Pride Puppy, is a rhyming alphabet book about a family searching for their lost dog at a pride parade. They go through the alphabet and point out a thing per letter that can be found at Pride. During oral arguments, Justice Gorsuch used the book to ask pointed questions about bondage, about a book for 3-year-olds. This is like if a senator interrupted a hearing on school lunch nutrition to ask detailed questions about the erotic potential of applesauce. The subject matter did not invite this. The subject matter was the alphabet. The school district had originally allowed opt-outs, but then they got so many requests that they stopped allowing them. A coalition of Muslim, Catholic, and Orthodox Christian parents sued. And the court ruled with the same 6-3 that refusing religious opt-outs violated the parents' free exercise rights. Alito wrote the opinion, and the school's curriculum got reclassified as a constitutional injury, which is the legal equivalent of calling a library book an assault weapon. Except for maybe actual assault weapons, which are fine. The school now has to prove there's no less restrictive way to teach kids how to read. In March of this year, 2026, Childs v. Salazar, in an 8-1 decision, Lori Childs, a therapist represented by ADF, challenged Colorado's ban on conversion therapy for minors. The court held that talk therapy is speech and that banning, quote, change-oriented counseling while allowing affirming counseling is viewpoint discrimination, and that the ban has to survive strict scrutiny, which it almost certainly cannot. Gorsuch wrote that opinion too, and every state with a conversion therapy ban is now vulnerable. The pattern across all 3 is the same move repeated. Take a law that protects people, relabel it as compelled speech or a burden on religious exercise, and force courts to treat enforcement like it's censorship. Every time the concrete reality of somebody getting hurt gets swapped for an abstract argument about messages and viewpoints. And every time the conservative supermajority buys it. The civil rights protections get to stay on the books. Nobody repeals them. They just become unenforceable for a constantly expanding list of people claiming religious or expressive exemptions, which is actually better than a repeal if you're the one running this operation. Repeal generates backlash. Hollowing laws out from the inside, one case at a time, that's quiet. Most people don't even notice until they try to use the law and discover that it's completely empty. And all of it was funded by the same donor layer that we just walked through. Leo's network money trains ADF's law students. It bankrolls their cases and runs ad campaigns for the judicial nominees who eventually rule on them. ADF builds the cases, the donors fund them, the judges the donors helped decide them. Then ADF uses the precedent to file the next round. That is the sort of legal layer of this stack. A factory that produces test cases, selects sympathetic plaintiffs, strips away messy reality, and feeds clean hypotheticals to a court that just keeps saying yes. But court victories will only get you so far. A favorable ruling means nothing if the executive branch won't enforce it, which is why the next layer turns legal victories into government policy. Because a court ruling is just words on paper until somebody with executive authority decides to act on it. And this is where the stack gets genuinely creepy, because the people running this layer aren't preachers or donors. They're bureaucrats, they're project managers, and they write everything down. So let me introduce you to Russell Vought. Vought ran Trump's Office of Management and Budget, which is one of those government offices that sounds boring enough to make your eyes glaze over. And that's the point, because OMB is where the executive branch controls what agencies can and can't do. It signs off on rules. It approves spending. If you wanted to quietly rewrite the federal government from the inside, you wouldn't start at the Pentagon with a guy in Crusader tattoos. You'd start at OMB with a guy in a tie. Vaught is that guy with said tie. He's also a self-described Christian nationalist. He wrote that openly, and in private speeches about what a second Trump term would look like, he said out loud that he wanted career civil servants to be, quote, traumatically affected when they wake up in the morning. He wanted federal employees to, quote, not want to go to work because they are increasingly viewed as the villains. That is a direct quote from a budget director, the person whose job it is to keep the machinery running, fantasizing about scientists and analysts being too demoralized to commute to work. Vaught is also one of the primary architects of Project 2025, and Project 2025's big structural innovation isn't a policy document, but a staffing database. The Heritage Foundation built something called the Presidential Personnel Database, paired with a training program called the Presidential Administration Academy. The idea is simple. You can't capture the executive branch if you don't have enough loyal people to fill the desks. There are roughly 4,000 political appointee positions across the federal government. Heritage wanted 20,000 vetted names ready to slot into all of them. A leaked copy of the back end showed over 13,000 submissions to the application form. 13,000 people filled out an ideological questionnaire and submitted their resumes to a database designed to feed them into government jobs. Some applicants, journalists found, cited Nazi theorists as intellectual influencers on their application essays, which is the kind of thing you'd think a database would filter for. You'd be wrong, but you can think it. And then come the executive orders. In February 2025, Trump signed an order creating the White House Faith Office. Now, previous administrations had faith-based partnership offices. They handled grants and community outreach. This one, though, is different. This one lives inside the Domestic Policy Council, which means it sits in the West Wing, closer to the president than any faith office have ever been. And its mandate is broad enough to make a constitutional lawyer very nervous. The Faith Office is directed to coordinate with every federal agency. It trains religious groups on how to get government grants. It instructs agencies to seek out religious liberty exceptions, accommodations, or exemptions across all their programs. That language, exceptions, accommodations, or exemptions, covers an enormous amount of ground. In English, it means a religious organization getting public money could refuse to hire LGBTQ staff. It means they could opt out of providing services that violate their doctrine, or fold prayer and evangelism straight into taxpayer-funded programs. It means compliance requirements that every other grantee has to follow might get waived because they're an unfair burden on a house of worship. Every agency now has to designate a faith liaison who reports to the West Wing. The plumbing of the federal grant-making is being rerouted. And then there's the executive order with the quiet title and the loud mandate, quote, eradicating anti-Christian bias. This one created a DOJ task force chaired by the Attorney General. Its members include the Secretaries of State, Defense, Labor, Health and Human Services, Education, Homeland Security, the FBI Director, and the EEOC Chair, which is almost the entire senior leadership of the federal government sitting on a task force dedicated to finding anti-Christian bias inside their own agencies. The task force is directed to review every executive department for, quote, unlawful anti-Christian policies, practices, or conduct. It can recommend agencies terminate those policies. It can propose new laws. It reports directly to the president. And what does anti-Christian bias look like in practice anyway? Well, here's my favorite example. The task force initial report highlighted as a showcase example of federal persecution, a fire safety citation. A Catholic hospital in Oklahoma was told that it could not keep a lit candle burning 24 hours a day next to oxygen equipment. Open flames near oxygen lines are a basic fire hazard, so now thermodynamics has an anti-Christian bias. Compulsion is persecuting the faithful. The oxidation of paraffin wax in proximity to pressurized medical oxygen is now a civil rights issue, and the Attorney General of the United States has been tasked with addressing it. We have assembled the Secretaries of State, Defense, Labor, Education, Health and Human Services, and the FBI Director and head of the EEOC, and their first order of business is a candle next to an oxygen tank in a hospital. The reason why they have to resort to such nothing burgers is that 87% of Congress identifies as Christian. 98% of elected Republicans identify as Christian. If this is persecution, it is the most unsuccessful case in a long, nuanced art of persecutioneering. It's just that it seems that a lot of these Christians have some kind of massive persecution complex and often see protections on people that they want to terrorize, harm, or even kill as discrimination against them. Meanwhile, the Mandate for Leadership, Project 2025's 900-page policy manual, lays out the administrative blueprint for all of this. Its first stated goal is to, quote, restore the family as the centerpiece of American life. And its fourth is securing God-given individual rights to live freely, which in context, the family means a specific type of family, and living freely means religious institutions being free from civil rights obligations. The document calls for dismantling DEI offices, eliminating what it calls Marxist indoctrination from schools without any explanation, and barring federal funding for abortion-related travel. And the personnel database supplies the people to do it. The faith liaisons are the enforcement network inside every agency. The Anti-Christian Bias Task Force is the complaint department that routes any pushback straight to the Attorney General. None of these pieces work alone. Together, they turn favorable court rulings into government policy into grant conditions into the rules that determine who gets funded and who gets investigated. The legal layer builds the precedent, and the executive layer makes it real. But even executive orders need political support to survive, which brings us to the piece of the stack that turns all of this into votes. There's a law called the Johnson Amendment. It's been on the books since 1954. Lyndon Johnson slipped it into the tax code while he was still a senator. The rule is simple, that if you are a 501c3 tax-exempt organization, you cannot endorse or oppose candidates for public office. Churches, charities, universities, all of them. If you violate it, the IRS can revoke your tax-exempt status entirely and hit you with excise taxes on top. The penalty is so severe that for decades it functioned as a nuclear deterrent. Nobody crossed the line. Nobody wanted to find out what the IRS would do. And then churches crossed the line, and the IRS did nothing. And everybody noticed. ProPublica and the Texas Tribune documented at least 20 churches openly endorsing candidates from the pulpit in just 2 years. That's more churches violating the law on camera than the IRS had investigated in the entire prior decade. After the 2004 election, the IRS actually tried. They looked at a little over 100 churches, and they sent warning letters. They did not do a single revocation. The nuclear option turned out to be like a Nerf dart. So conservative churches then started running a campaign called Pulpit Freedom Sunday. Thousands of pastors would stand up, endorse a named candidate on camera, and then mail the video to the IRS as like a dare. Come, here's the evidence, come get us. And in 1 year alone, roughly 1,600 pastors participated. And the IRS did almost nothing. The whole thing became an inside joke about a law that nobody would actually enforce. My favorite example is a Texas pastor in 2021 standing at the pulpit before a city council runoff. He tells his congregation very carefully that he can't endorse anyone because of the church's tax-exempt status. He then pauses, nods, and says, "But you'll get the message," and then proceeds to praise one candidate and tear apart the other for 10 minutes. The Johnson Amendment had turned into some kind of weird dinner theater. Then, in July 2025, the IRS decided to just make it official. A case called National Religious Broadcasters versus Billy Long, Eastern District of Texas, 2 churches and a Broadcasters Association challenged the Johnson Amendment. And the IRS, instead of defending the law it was supposed to enforce, agreed with them. In a proposed consent judgment, the agency took the position that pastors endorsing candidates on their own congregations doesn't count as intervening in a campaign. So here's the language that tells you everything about the angle they went with. The IRS argued that a pastor endorsing a candidate from the pulpit is no different than, direct quote from their court filing, a family discussion concerning candidates. A family discussion, hundreds of people in a room with one microphone and no reply button, receiving instructions from a man who claims to channel the will of God. Was nobody else's family discussion like that? That's one big non-tax-paying family. Now, the court actually rejected the consent judgment in March of 2026 and dismissed the case for lack of jurisdiction. No binding decree, no formal IRS guidance. The law is technically unchanged, but for a deterrent that only worked because people feared enforcement, the IRS publicly announcing it won't enforce, it's functionally the same as a repeal. Picture the incentive structure here. You're a political campaign. You need voters in a high-trust environment where your message bypasses ad fatigue and media skepticism. You need an audience that shows up every week, trusts the messenger, and has built-in organizing infrastructure, phone trees, small groups, volunteer networks. You need a tax-exempt costing the campaign almost nothing, while the public subsidizes it through foregone revenue. That's a church. And unlike a super PAC, a church doesn't file a Form 990. Other charities publicly report their financials, their board members, their major donors. Churches are automatically exempt from all of that. Congress gave them special protections and make IRS audits exceptionally difficult to even initiate. So you get a political operation with a captive audience, a trusted spokesman, and a donor base that is completely invisible. After the IRS filing, Mercy Culture Church in Fort Worth posted the news with the caption, "Time for the church to get loud." The New Yorker profiled the church this year. Pastor Landon Schott preached a sermon ostensibly about generosity, then told his congregation that Democrats aren't real Christians. He called Kamala Harris a demonic Jezebel, and the church runs a political nonprofit called For Liberty and Justice that's building networks of like-minded congregations across multiple states, running what amount to campaign events held in sanctuaries. When reporters asked whether his endorsements might threaten his tax-exempt status, Schott's response was, quote, "Big whoop." And he's right. The penalty is meaningless when the enforcer has publicly gone off duty. That's a big whoop. An enormous whoop, even. Now, I want to be honest. The evidence for a new massive wave of new pulpit endorsements since the IRS shift is a little thin. A few Texas churches, a pastor in Georgia saying that he'd absolutely consider endorsing candidates for the midterms. The story so far is about changed incentives, but there isn't a documented transformation yet. Mostly because a lot of these decisions happened last year and the elections are just about to get started. But that's the scarier framing. The machinery is in place and the guardrails are now gone. A wealthy donor can route money through a church, get a tax deduction, stay completely anonymous, and fund an operation that looks like worship but functions like a campaign. The donor's name never appears in any public database, the church never files the disclosures every other charity has to file, and the pastor delivers the message to people who came here to talk to God, the admin of reality in their minds. And that's just the electoral layer. Again, let's go back. Legal protection, financial opacity, and a built-in audience that shows up every week on faith alone. The law stays on the books, the enforcement is gone. And the midterms are this November, which brings us to the last layer. We've seen the money, the legal factory, the executive machinery, the electoral pipeline, but all of it runs on people. Millions of them. And the question you should be asking is, how many? And what are they willing to do? All of this runs on people. Warm bodies in pews, giving money, giving time, giving votes, giving their Sunday mornings. And the question you should be asking this whole time is, how many? PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, tried to answer that. They interviewed over 22,000 American adults across 2025 and asked them to agree or disagree with 5 statements. And I want you to hear these statements because they are doing a lot of heavy lifting. So first, the US government should declare America a Christian nation. 2, US laws should be based on Christian values. 3, if the US moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. 4, being Christian is an important part of being truly American. And 5, the big one, God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. That last one's not subtle. Dominion over all areas. That is Seven Mountains mandate language showing up in a nationally representative survey, and people are agreeing with it. Not most people, but enough. PRI scores your answers on a scale from 0 to 1 and sorts you into 4 groups. If you completely disagree with everything, you're a rejecter. Somewhere in the middle, skeptic or sympathizer, depending upon how much you lean. And if your composite score hits 0.75 or above, meaning you overwhelmingly agree or completely agree with basically all 5, you are an adherent. And the numbers were that 11% of Americans are adherents, 21% are sympathizers, so that's roughly a third of the country in the yes column. And then on the other side, we have 37% who are skeptics and about 27% who are rejectors. So about 2/3 of the country disagrees. Hold that number though, we're gonna come back to it later in this video. But here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting, I mean significantly worse. PRI also runs something called a right-wing authoritarianism scale. These are 4 statements, and these are, I need you to understand, the actual survey wording that real Americans are calmly rating on a scale of completely agree to completely disagree. 1. The only way our country can get through the crisis ahead is to get back to our traditional values, put some tough leaders in power, and silence the troublemakers spreading bad ideas. 2. Our country will be destroyed someday if we do not smash the perversions eating away at our moral fiber and traditional beliefs. 3. What our country really needs is a strong, determined leader who will crush evil and take us back to our true path. And 4. Our country will be great if we honor the ways of our forefathers, do what the authorities tell us to do, and get rid of the rotten apples who are ruining everything. Among Christian nationalism adherents, the overlap is almost total. 79% score high or very high on that authoritarianism scale. Only 7% score low. If you meet 3 adherents, at least 2 of them are telling the surveyor they want tough leaders who will silence troublemakers and smash perversions. And it maps onto geography in ways that should concern you. In Mississippi and Oklahoma, a bare majority of all residents qualify as adherents or sympathizers, 51%. Arkansas is at 49, West Virginia is at 48, North Dakota is at 46. In these states, Christian nationalism is not fringe. It's a neighborhood norm. It's the person next to you at the grocery store. And the correlation with Republican legislative dominance is almost mechanical. Arkansas has an average Christian nationalism score of 0.52 on the PRI scale, and Republicans hold about 81.5% of legislative seats. Meanwhile, Massachusetts is at 15%. Vermont, Rhode Island, New Jersey are all under 20. Flying from Boston to Jackson, Mississippi is a time travel experiment in church-state separation. Now, here's the stat that will sit with you though. PRI asked respondents whether they agree with the statement that because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save our country. Nationally, 17% of people agree with that. Among Christian nationalism adherents, during the Biden administration, it fluctuated between 38 and 43%. After Trump won re-election, it dropped to 32%. So support for political violence among adherents went down once their guy was in power. The threat of extra legal force tracks with whether the movement controls the state. When they're out of power, more of them think violence is necessary. When they're in, they relax. The whole thing operates like a thermostat. Meanwhile, among rejectors, support for political violence has ticked up since Trump took office again. The people who reject Christian nationalism are starting to feel like the system isn't working for them anymore. Both sides of this divide are moving towards the same conclusion from opposite directions, which is a terrible place for democracy to be. One more number, okay? When PRI asked whether, quote, immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background, 67% of adherents agree, 53% of sympathizers. The Great Replacement Conspiracy Theory, the one which motivated the El Paso Walmart shooting, the one that animated the Jews will not replace us chant in Charlottesville, that theory has majority support inside the Christian nationalism base. A third of all Americans are in this tent, and among the most committed slice, 2/3 believe the country is being ethnically replaced. That's the mass base. That's what powers this whole stack. The donors write checks, the lawyers manufacture cases, the executive branch rewrites rules, the churches deliver votes, and underneath it all, tens of millions of Americans who agree that God called Christians to exercise dominion over every area of society, who want strong leaders to crush evil and silence troublemakers, and who are increasingly comfortable saying so out loud to a stranger with a clipboard. So, now you've seen all 5 layers. You've seen how the donor money feeds the legal factory, how the court victories get implemented by executive order, how the church delivers the votes to keep the whole operation staffed. The structure does the coordinating. Nobody needs to sit in a room, and probably right about now, you're feeling like you've got the picture. You understand that machine. You can see how it all works. Now hold on to that feeling for a second, because I'm about to mess with it. Okay, so now you have seen all 5 layers. You've seen how the donor money feeds the legal factory, how the court victories get implemented by executive order, how the churches deliver the votes to keep the whole apparatus staffed. The structure does the coordinating, so nobody needs to sit in some kind of smoke-filled room and drink, I don't know, Dr. Peppers and plan all this out. And right about now, you're probably feeling like you've got the picture. You can understand the shape of this machine that we've been talking about. You can see how it works. So hang on to that for a second, because now I'm going to mess with it. Let's start with a quick recap, because this is a long video and you deserve it. You've been here for quite a while. So a part-time Fox News host with Crusader tattoos is currently running the Pentagon. And he got this job from a staffing pipeline that was built by a group called the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation gets its money from a network controlled by one guy operating out of a UPS store in Utah. That money funds a legal army that manufactures Supreme Court cases on a production line, and those court rulings then get turned into executive orders by ideologues who want federal employees to be, quote, traumatically affected when they wake up in the morning. And the whole thing is powered by churches that the IRS just gave permission to operate as campaign offices. And here is where a normal YouTube video would probably start wrapping up. You know, cue the ominous music, flash the PRI numbers one more time and tell you to like, share, and subscribe, and then roll the credits. But, I mean, look down there. I can't do that. This is a step back. What are you talking about? Because there's something that we haven't dealt with, and if I let you walk away without dealing with it, the whole analysis kind of falls apart the first time you're going to bring it up in a real conversation. Because here's the problem. If you go talk to your aunt or your coworker or your old college roommate who started going to a mega church after their divorce and tell them everything that I just told you, you lay out the stack, name Leonard Leo, explain the pipeline, show them the numbers, they'll look at you and say, so what? I just love Jesus and think America should have Christian values. Why are you making that sound like some kind of conspiracy? And they will mean it. That's the kind of part that makes this whole topic difficult. People will, that's the kind of part that'll make this topic difficult. They genuinely, sincerely mean it. So this is where I'm going to have to be honest with you about something that's a little bit uncomfortable, because the loudest critics of the Christian nationalist framework aren't all bad faith grifters on Fox News. Some of them are making points that deserve a real answer, and some of those people are academics. Philip Gorski and his co-authors published a paper in 2022 called What Isn't Christian Nationalism? Their argument was that the survey scales that researchers use to measure this thing, including the one that PRI uses, are so broadly worded that they sweep up ordinary conservative Christians who just want their values represented in public life. The scales don't leave room for any middle ground. You either score as a threat or you don't. There's no category for, I think the golden rule should influence policy, but I don't necessarily want a theocracy. And that is a real methodological concern that comes from sociologists, not the Heritage Foundation. Joshua Lawson at the Heritage Foundation made a cruder version of the same point and calls Christian nationalism a dog whistle used to bundle white supremacy with standard conservative views on marriage and family. His version is a little bit more polemical, but the core complaint overlaps with the academic one. The label is too elastic. It stretches until it covers basically anybody who prays and votes Republican. And then there's the lived religion crowd. So scholars like Nancy Tatum Amarin at Boston University, who study what ordinary believers actually do and think, have a completely different objection. They say that the class technology frame, the frame that I've been using for the last, I don't know, however long we've been going so far, commits a kind of intellectual crime. It takes millions of people with sincere, deeply held moral commitments to what other people should be allowed to do with their lives. Or people who oppose abortion because they genuinely believe undifferentiated cells have some kind of magical allspark. People who defend traditional marriage because they genuinely believe God ordained it and therefore it's their business, and flattens that all into useful idiots for a billionaire donor network. It treats working class believers like dupes whose stated reasons for believing things are just rationalizations for someone else's power play. And if you've spent any time around actual church-going families, you know that that doesn't match reality. I know people who go to church. I don't get it, but I don't fault them for it. I spent years studying Islamophobia. It's the topic of my master's thesis. And one thing that it taught me was that faith, nationality, ethnicity, and identity get braided together in ways that don't necessarily untangle neatly. Religion, as far as my experience researching and studying it, is a force multiplier. It makes the best and worst come out of people. The problem isn't that these people believe. The problem is what the machine does with what they believe. These aren't people who sat down and did a cost-benefit analysis of Leonard Leo's dark money network before deciding how they feel about abortion. They feel it in their bones. They pray about it. They cry about it. They do whatever the hell speaking in tongues is about it. Their faith is the most real thing in their lives, and telling them it's all a cover story for segregationists is going to make them stop listening to you forever. So, let me give you the best, most generous version of the argument against everything that I have been telling you so far. PRI's survey asks people to agree with extreme statements like God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. When a third of Americans say yes, that sounds terrifying, but what if Christian values means something different to different people? I remember once that my mom once told me this completely baffling thing where she said that traditional values just means community togetherness and neighborly help. So what if some of them hear the golden rule should inform our laws and others hear we need a theocracy, and the survey just can't tell the difference? So what if the instrument, the survey itself is making this alarming category that it claims to be measuring? And what if the people inside that category, the real humans, aren't plotting anything? What if they're just going to church, raising their kids, and voting with their conscience, and they're genuinely confused about why a guy with a keffiyeh on YouTube is treating them like enemies, oblivious to the fact that they seem to think that they can dictate other people's lives? Every political constituency tries to make its values the law. Labor unions do it, environmentalists do it, reproductive rights advocates do it. Why is it sinister when Christians do the same thing? So that's the best argument I could put together for their position. And parts of it are correct. The sincerity in the belief is real. I do need to say that clearly. The rank and file believers who show up in the PRI's data as adherents or sympathizers are not, in the main, sitting around planning a theocratic coup. Most of them don't even use the term Christian nationalist about themselves. Scholars and explainers say outright that the label is more analytical and not a grassroots term. These are people who call themselves Christians, who call themselves patriots, parents who are just trying to do the right thing by their kids. The label comes from researchers looking at their study answers. It didn't come from the believers looking in the mirror and making a label for themselves. And the experimental data backs up something a little bit more specific. A 2024 study in Politics and Religion by Broen and Juppe ran a clever experiment. They gave people a scenario where someone broke a minor law and randomly assigned the lawbreaker an identity. Baptist, football fan, Muslim, or vegan. And they asked, do you give them a warning or do you throw the book at them? And Christian nationalists were much more lenient with the Baptist, so they experienced some form of in-group love. They gave their own people a break, but what was interesting is that they weren't harsher on the Muslim or the vegan than the non-Christian nationalists were. The outgroup hate wasn't always running. It only kicked in when respondents also felt that Christians were under persecution. The hostility was conditional. It just needed some way to flip a switch. So the rank and file weren't walking around seething with a hatred for outsiders. The hatred is activated later by specific cues from specific elites at specific moments. So you might be thinking, great, so they're basically fine. The panic is overblown. Maybe I can just relax. And you know you cannot. This is step back. What are you talking about? Because here is what this argument really misses. This theoretical defense argues that these are sincere people, so stop treating them like pawns. And yes, they are sincere, but the system doesn't need them to be pawns. The system needs them to be sincere. Sincerity is the whole point here. A cynical base would actually be useless. You can buy cynical people for a while, but they don't show up every single Sunday morning. They don't volunteer for phone banks because they think God wants them to. They don't give 10% of their income to an institution that passes it upwards. They don't raise their kids inside the worldview so the next generation arrives preloaded with the same convictions. Cynicism is expensive to maintain. It burns out. But sincerity is renewable. Sincerity shows up in the rain. The machine that I just spent so much of your precious life dissecting, from Leonard Leo's billion-dollar mailbox to the ADF case factory to the heritage staffing pipeline, none of it works without millions of people who genuinely believe that they're doing the right thing. The system doesn't convert belief into power despite the belief being real. It converts belief into power because the belief is real. Take the sincerity away and the stack actually collapses, which means the interesting question was never, are they sincere or are they cynical? That's actually a false binary that this theoretical defense wants you stuck on. The interesting question is, how did millions of sincere believers end up powering a machine that was originally built for a completely different purpose? Because the stack wasn't always about abortion. It wasn't always about parental rights. It wasn't always about Christian values in the abstract. It started with something very specific, something that the architects of this machine would very much like you to not know about. And I should be honest about my blind spots here. Being outside this movement makes the subject feel intellectually manageable in a way that can flatten the genuine terror of people who are inside it or adjacent to it. Someone who grew up in this world would probably tell me that I'm underestimating just how smart the organizers are, or overestimating how much that this is a top-down versus genuinely grassroots movement, and missing the way that it works on people, not because they're stupid, but because it meets real needs: community, meaning, certainty, belonging. Something that, a capitalist society conspicuously fails to provide. Ed Dobson was one of Jerry Falwell's closest associates, Falwell being the guy, the face of the religious right. Ed helped draft the moral majority platform. He was there when the whole thing was built. And when a historian named Randall Ballmer tracked him down years later and asked him about the origin story, about how the movement really started, Dobson didn't give him some cinematic conspiracy. He actually kind of gave him a shrug. He said that he sat in the, quote, non-smoke-filled back room in the moral majority, and he frankly did not remember abortion being mentioned as a reason that they ought to do something. Abortion, the defining moral issue of the American right for 50 years. And the guy who was in the room when it all started said that, yeah, that it didn't actually come up. So if it wasn't abortion, what was it? In 1971, a federal court issued a ruling called Green v. Connolly. And what that ruling threatened, what actually lit the fuse, is going to reframe everything that you have heard so far. Because, yeah, bitch, you saw this video timeline, batten down the hatches, we got some fucking history to do. Okay, 1971, Green v. Connolly, let's talk about it. A group of black parents and taxpayers in Mississippi went to court with a straightforward complaint. Their tax dollars were subsidizing schools that existed for the sole purpose of keeping their children out. Not schools that happened to be white, schools that were created white on purpose the very moment that public schools got told to integrate. Publicly funded, segregated schools. And you know what? The Supreme Court was like, yeah, that's not charitable. If your school is going to discriminate on the basis of race, the IRS is not going to call you a charity, so you don't get to be tax exempt, and your donors don't get to deduct their contributions. The Supreme Court affirmed it in the same year, so it was done. It was legally settled, and the IRS adopted the principle as Revenue Ruling 71-447. Private schools that practice racial discrimination do not get to qualify as 501c3 organizations. Period. Yay! A small victory for racial justice. But now here's what the ruling actually threatened, because this wasn't a hypothetical legal principle floating around in a law review. This was a financial kill shot aimed at hundreds of schools that had just been built in a hurry for one reason. Let's rewind a few years. After Brown v. Board in 1954, Southern state legislators didn't just resist desegregation, they planned for it. At least 10 states passed tuition grant laws, tax credits, and asset transfer provisions designed to let white parents pull their kids out of public schools and into private ones the moment that integration actually happened. When that moment came, and it came slowly at first and then all at once in the late 60s after the Supreme Court stopped accepting delay tactics, and the white families left. By 1969, roughly 300,000 white students across 11 southern states were enrolled in segregated private schools. That's out of 7.4 million white students total. In Arkansas alone, at least 32 of these schools opened between 1966 and 1972, enrolling about 5,000 white kids in a state that didn't have all that many people to begin with. These schools were not elite prep schools. They were emergency infrastructure. Some of them met in church basements and strip malls. The brochures called them Christian academies. And when one of these academies opened in a small southern town, the damage to the public system was immediate and permanent. Recent research found that a single segregation academy opening nearby caused public school enrollment to drop 9 to 14%. In some Alabama and Louisiana districts, white enrollment in public schools fell by a third and never recovered over the next 15 years. Federal investigators documented places where a single new Christian academy didn't just take a few families from the top, it drained, and I'm using their language here, most or all white students and many white teachers out of the public system in one fell swoop. The public school was technically desegregated. It was also completely gutted. Same schools, no resources, and they could point to the enrollment numbers and say, see, integration has failed. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy that was underwritten because these schools, as Christian academies, had tax-deductible donations. So that was what Green v. Connolly was initially aimed at. An entire parallel school system that had been built in about 5 years that was designed to let white Southerners comply with the letter of the civil rights law while completely ignoring the spirit. And the IRS just said, no, we're not going to give you money to do racism anymore. So now the question you should be asking is, what happened when these schools fought back? Because they did fight back. And the argument that they used is one that should make your ears perk up a little bit. They said that it was their religious freedom. Not all of them. The secular segregation academies, the ones that were just like country clubs with classrooms, those ones had nothing to hide behind. But the church-affiliated schools, the ones that called themselves Christian academies, they had at least this card to play. They argued that their admissions policies were based on sincere religious belief and that the Bible required racial segregation, and that the government was violating their First Amendment by conditioning tax exemptions on compliance with secular anti-discrimination rules. And the IRS, to its credit, actually thought about that in advance. Revenue Ruling 75-231 includes a hypothetical. I love this. The IRS wrote itself a scenario where a church insists that schools must exclude certain races because the tenets of the religion require it. And the IRS's own answer in writing was, it still fails the charity test. A religious basis for discrimination, and that's a direct quote from the ruling, said that would not serve to preclude governmental interference. The US Commission on Civil Rights weighed in too, and their conclusion was that it was unlikely that the First Amendment would shield such private religious schools from the racial non-discrimination requirement, even when those schools claimed that they had sincerely held religious beliefs. The legal consensus then became pretty clear that you can believe whatever you want, you just can't make the taxpayer pay for it. And this brings us all to Bob Jones University. And this is the part where this gets really personal for the people who built the machine that we just talked about. Bob Jones is a fundamentalist Christian university in Grenville, South Carolina. Until 1971, it banned all Black applicants. From 1971 to 1975, it would only admit Black students who were already married. And I want you to think about why for a second. If you're married, you can't date anybody on campus. The admissions policy was specifically designed to prevent interracial relationships at the school while technically allowing Black enrollment. After 1975, it admitted unmarried Black students, but kept an explicitly written rule in the student handbook that there would be no interracial dating. They spelled it out in their disciplinary code. Students in international marriages were expelled. Students who joined a group that supported international marriage, also expelled. Students who encouraged others to question a policy, also expelled. Students who dated outside their own race, expelled. And Bob Jones eventually dropped the interracial dating ban. In 2000, I was in grade 7, X-Men was in the theaters, the future had arrived, and Bob Jones University was still banning interracial dating. It only stopped after George W. Bush visited the campus during his presidential campaign, and the national press went, wait, this place still does what? And the school had to quietly rescind the rule. So it's not like they changed their minds. Anyways, the IRS revoked Bob Jones University's tax-exempt status in 1976 and made it retroactive to 1970. The school sued, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. Bob Jones University v. United States in 1983, and it resulted in an 8-1 decision. The court's holding was simple and devastating. Tax-exempt status requires serving a charitable purpose, and racial discrimination in education violates the, quote, fundamental public policy. Therefore, a school that discriminates on race is not charitable, and denying it a tax subsidy does not violate the First Amendment. Chief Justice Berger wrote that the government's interest in eliminating racial discrimination in education was compelling enough to justify the indirect burden on religious practice. The religious freedom argument hit a wall, a big 8-justice-strong wall. And this is the moment, right here, when the entire story of the Christian right in America pivots. Because up until 1983, the conservative evangelical movement had been fighting a defensive action on its own terms. They were openly defending segregated schools. They were openly arguing that the Bible required racial segregation. They were saying out loud that the IRS had no right to tell Christian institutions who they could and couldn't admit. And they lost. They lost badly. They lost publicly at the highest court in the entire United States. So what do you do when your original cause becomes legally indefensible and publicly toxic? You find a new cause. This is where Paul Weyrich comes in. And I need you to understand what Weyrich was, because he is the hinge in which the entire modern religious right swings. He was not a pastor. He was not a theologian. He was a political operative and a co-founder of the Heritage Foundation. He was also the co-founder of ALEC. He's the guy who coined the phrase moral majority before Jerry Falwell ever used it. His job, his actual professional function, was building conservative coalitions and finding the messages that made them work. And he was honest about it. Embarrassingly, retroactively, honest. In 1990, Weyrich stood up at a conference of religious right leaders in Washington and said out loud to the room, "Let's remember that this movement, the religious right, did not get going in response to abortion. not at all. A historian named Randall Balmer just happened to be in the room at the time. Now, Balmer is a Dartmouth professor. He is an Emmy-nominated, prize-winning. He holds the oldest endowed chair in religion at the school. He spent decades studying American evangelicalism, and his historian brain went, wait, what? So during a break at the conference, Balmer cornered Weyrich, and he asked him, am I hearing you right? Abortion had nothing to do with how this movement started? And Weyrich was emphatic. Absolutely not. What Weyrich described instead was a decade of failed experiments. He tried to organize evangelicals around pornography, and that didn't work. He tried school prayer, that didn't work. The Equal Rights Amendment also didn't work. And in his own words, he utterly failed to build a mass political movement around any of these issues. What finally worked was the IRS going after Christian schools. That's what lit the fuse, not Roe v. Wade, not prayer in schools. The moment that the federal government threatened the tax-exempt status of segregated Christian academies, suddenly, millions of white evangelicals who had never engaged in politics started picking up the phone. But here's the problem that Weyrich faced. Defending our right to run segregated schools doesn't really work at the national level. It's not a campaign slogan that you can sell. You can maybe sell it in a church basement in rural Mississippi, but you couldn't sell it in a presidential election. The material was there was genuine emotion, but the message was poison. So Weyrich just went shopping. He watched the 1978 midterm elections and saw that 3 anti-abortion Republicans won in Minnesota. Weyrich's correspondence from that period, which Balmer later read in the Weyrich Papers at the University of Wyoming, practically vibrates with excitement. He founded the issue that could galvanize grassroots evangelicals into a national political force. An issue that sounded moral, felt urgent, and importantly, wasn't a defense of segregation. Abortion. Ed Dobson confirmed all of this. Dobson was one of Jerry Falwell's closest guys. He helped draft the Moral Majority's actual platform. And years later, when Balmer asked him about the founding moment, Dobson said he sat in the non-smoke-filled back rooms of the Moral Majority, and he frankly did not remember abortion being mentioned as a reason that they ought to do something. So picture that room for a second. Pastors and operatives trying to figure out how to sell their cause to America. They weren't storming heaven over Roe. They were workshopping different ways that they could save segregated Christian schools from the IRS. Abortion came much later. Abortion was the issue that actually worked. Weyrich later described all of this with the detachment of like a guy reviewing an ad campaign. So again, he tried pornography and nobody really responded. School prayer had low engagement. The Equal Rights Amendment, it polled okay, but no, it wasn't great. The man was basically A/B testing moral panics like a product manager trying to find a new flavor of M&Ms. He kept testing messages the way that product managers test slogans. And the evangelical base just kind of kept shrugging at all the things they tried. But then the IRS tried to threaten the schools, and suddenly everybody was really activated. And Dobson, for his part, didn't stay comfortable with the machine that he had helped build. And so he later described that the whole Moral Majority project was as an illusion, saying a movement that had been caught up in an illusion that political change would bring moral change. He left. He actually supported Obama in 2008, citing compassion for the poor and being a peacemaker, which is a wildly heterodox move for a guy who wrote Falwell's talking points. And surprisingly Christian, I might add. He was diagnosed with ALS in 2000 and spent his remaining years arguing that you can either be a prophet who stands outside power and calls out injustice, or you can be the king, and that you cannot be both. That line, prophet or king, is one of the sharpest internal critiques anybody from inside the movement has ever produced. Now, I do need to be fair here because this is a history that gets contested, and I don't want to overstate the evidence. The conservative counterargument goes like this. They would argue that the religious right grew from many different sources. They, were anti-abortion, but they were also anti-communism. They didn't like the sexual revolution, and they did support school prayer. Abortion genuinely feels like a moral issue to millions of ordinary believers who never once ever thought about tax exemptions. Weyrich's 1990 recollection is just one data point, not a comprehensive history. And when the IRS proposed its stricter enforcement rules in 1978, those rules threatened schools that were ethnically homogenous for non-racial reasons too. So Catholic schools, Jewish schools, Amish schools, and the backlash was at least partly about government overreach, not about maintaining segregation. And parts of it are correct. The 1978 IRS proposal really was broad. It would have presumed that any private school founded during desegregation to be discriminatory unless its minority enrollment hit at least 1/5 of the surrounding community's minority share. And the United States was segregated geographically fairly often too. So if you had a private school in a community that just also happened to be really, really white, you might come under you might come under scrutiny. The IRS literally wrote this fraction into a proposed regulation for measuring whether your school was racist enough to lose its tax break. So you could see how a Catholic school in like 90% white town in New England might look at the math and panic. So Congress killed the proposal with appropriations riders, blocking the IRS from spending money to implement it. But the underlying doctrine from Green v. Connolly stayed intact. The stricter rules died, but the principle survived. But what this, conservative counter-argument can't explain is the timeline. So Roe v. Wade was decided in January of 1973. The Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution that same year affirming that abortion could be acceptable in certain circumstances. W.A. Criswell, the former SBC president and one of the most prominent Baptist pastors in the country, said that he was glad for the decision. The evangelical response to Roe in 1973 ranged from to Anti-abortion was actually at that time widely seen as kind of like a Catholic thing. The massive organized top-down evangelical mobilization did not happen in 1973. It didn't happen in 1974 or 1975 or even 1976. It happened in 1978 and 1979 when the IRS crackdown on Christian schools was at its peak and Rayrich was shopping for a saleable replacement issue. So that gap is very important. There was 6 years between Roe and the moral majority. During those 6 years, the evangelical base was furious about tax exemptions for their schools and functionally indifferent to abortion. So they were angry. The cause was always, though, schools. The branding changed only when it had to. And I need to show you why this matters right now, because this machine did not stop running when it switched from segregation to abortion, and actually it has since switched multiple times. The American Organization of American Historians has a teaching resource that documents how white evangelical communities opened private schools as a direct method to oppose desegregation, then marketed that resistance as a defense of religious freedom rather than a defense of segregation. So the brochures didn't say keep schools white, they said protect our religious freedoms and save Christian education. That framing religious freedom as the mask for hierarchy maintenance is the new template, and the movement keeps pulling it out of the drawer. In the 1970s, the issue was segregated schools and the language was religious freedom. After the schools lost, the issue became abortion and the language became right to life. When abortion alone wasn't enough, it expanded to family values and anti-gay marriage stuff. When that failed, it turned into an anti-trans panic. At least 8 states have laws requiring or strongly encouraging schools to report a student's new pronouns or gender marker to their parents. Indiana, Tennessee, and others. They're called parental rights protections. The same language is used and the same legal architecture, the same coalition running through just a new set of targets. In the 1970s, white parents pulled their kids out of newly integrated public schools and put them in these Christian academies. And in the 2020s, red state legislatures are passing laws that require public schools to surveil queer kids and report them to their parents. California passed AB 1955, which bans forced outing policies, and the federal government opened an investigation into it. Their framing is that parents have a right to their children's school records, parental rights. At least 598 of California's roughly 1,000 school districts, including LA Unified, have policies restricting gender identity disclosure without student permission. The Ninth Circuit paused a federal judge's ruling that would have let teachers override those protections. The fight is still alive, and both sides are using parental rights as their banner. Both sides say that they're defending families. For a queer kid in Tennessee whose teacher is now legally forced to tell their parents about their pronouns, parental rights means something closer to surveillance rather than protection. The target changed, the branding changed, the function stayed the same. You use the language of freedom, family, and faith to maintain a hierarchy where certain people get to decide how other people's children live. And the infrastructure is what we walked through in the first half of this video. The donors, the legal factory, the executive pipeline, the church-to-ballot network, the PRI mass base. All of it was originally built to defend the right to keep Black children out of Christian schools at the government's expense. When that became unsellable, they found new products for the same machine. Abortion, parental rights, anti-Christian bias. The catalog updates every so often. You had critical race theory, you had anti-woke, whatever they're going to think of day to day. But it's essentially the same thing. So now, here is the part that I have been promising since I brought up Greenfield Connolly, because everything I just told you, the entire genealogy from segregation to abortion to parental rights, it rewrites the story of what this machine is for. When we walked through the stack earlier, you saw a power system. Donors, lawyers, executive orders, churches. You could see how it functioned, but you might have been thinking, okay, but the people inside this system genuinely believe in these causes. They're not thinking about segregation. They're thinking about their faith and their families. And that's true. They are. Remember what we said earlier, their sincerity is the fuel. But now you know something that the rank and file do not. The machine that they are powering was designed for a very different job. The original architects built it to defend racial hierarchy in education. When that became too expensive to say out loud, they repackaged the energy into a new campaign, and a new one after that, and a new one after that. Each time, millions of sincere believers signed on because the new cause felt morally urgent. Each time, the infrastructure stayed in the same hands, serving the same function, converting religious energy into political power, and political power that protects people at the top of the hierarchy. And don't think that this money doesn't go to media sources, influencers, and the like to raise consciousness and put these moral panics into the church-going conversation in the first place, feeding their own machine. Weyrich told you this. Dobson told you this. They said it out loud in a room full of their own allies. In 1990, the movement was never about abortion. It was about who gets to be allowed in certain schools on the taxpayer dime, and by extension, who gets to run everything else. And that brings us to right now, to the 2026 midterms, if they happen, to the IRS letting churches endorse candidates, to Pete Hegseth praying for violence at the Pentagon, to Mahmoud V. Taylor giving religious parents a legal veto over the public school curriculum, to 8 states requiring teachers to report queer kids to their parents under the banner of parental rights, something that could very well be endangering their lives. All of it, every piece, connects back to the same question that the movement has been asking since 1971. Does the government have the right to stop them, or even stop paying them, to discriminate? Their answer has always been no, and they have spent 50 years and billions of dollars building a machine to enforce that answer, no matter what the courts or the voters or the Constitution says. The branding will keep changing, but that machine will not. So, that's the genealogy, the segregation to abortion to parental rights to anti-woke pipeline, running through the same donor networks, the same legal shops, the same churches for now half a century. And if you're sitting there thinking, okay, I see the history, I see the system, but what does this actually look like when you put it all together in 2026? Good, because that is exactly what I'm about to show you. But first, so we have spent a lot of this video talking about how power makes real things and turns them into instruments. Real faith, real community, real moral conviction, all of it fed into a pipeline that outputs court cases and executive orders. Sarah Zed just made a video about what happens when power does that to real people. It's called 3 Dead Girls I Love, and honestly, watching it, it kind of wrecked me. She tells the story of 3 women, Jane Grey, Arsinoe of Egypt, and Hildegard Rodriguez. Jane Grey read Plato in Greek at 13. She corresponded with theologians, argued scripture with bishops twice her age. And we remember her as a painting of a blindfolded girl groping for the executioner's block. Arsinoe commanded fleets and held Alexandria under siege against Julius Caesar. And we remember her in Golden Chains. Hildegard wrote 16 books on sexual freedom in the goddamn 1930s in Spain, and we remember how her mother shot her. The archive gorges on their worst moments and starves their lives. The spectacular death, though, buries their dangerous ideas. And then Sarah connects it forward to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls vanishing from federal databases. She connects it to deportation flights, edited into ASMR content. How hypervisibility at someone's most degraded moment and total erasure aren't opposites. They're the same mechanism. I've been thinking about it a lot since I started making this video. And if you made it this far into what I'm doing today, you probably understand why. Now, you can watch 3 Dead Girls I Love right now only on Nebula. Nebula is the independent streaming platform where creators like Sarah and myself put out works like this completely ad-free. And you can, right now, dear Step Back viewer, get 50% off with my link. You go to go.nebula.tv/stepback. $30 a year, about $2.50 a month. There's going to be a link in the description for go.nebula.tv/stepback, along with a direct link to Sarah's video. Go watch it after this video, of course, because we still have a whole big machine to keep tearing apart. Go.nebula.tv/stepback because, you know you want. Alrighty, let's come back up for some air, do some breathing exercises. So now you have watched the entire origin story. You saw how the machine was built to defend segregated schools, then got rebranded around abortion when the old sales pitch stopped working. Then rebranded again around parental rights when they basically won on abortion, but abortion alone wasn't enough to keep the base activated. So the branding then changes, but the function stays the same. Protect the hierarchy, convert belief into state power, keep the money flowing upward through institutions that never have to file a Form 990. And I promise you that I'd show you what this all looks like when you reassemble it in 2026. So let's re-examine the stack, but this time we're going to look at it a little differently, because before we went to the genealogy, the stack was a diagram, 5 layers with clean donors, legal, executive, electoral, churches, clean, mechanical. You could see how the pieces fit. Now you know something else. You know the foundation that all of those pieces sit on was poured in the 1970s by men who were defending the right to keep black kids out of their schools on the US taxpayers' dime. So every layer that we have walked through, every piece of infrastructure, Leonard Leo's billion-dollar mailbox, the ADF's case factory, the heritage staffing pipeline, the IRS rolling over the Johnson Amendment, all of it grew from a coalition assembled to fight desegregation. The coalition kept running, it just updated what products it was pushing. It just changed the label on the box. So, when Pete Hegseth stands at the Pentagon podium and prays for overwhelming violence during a war with Iran, you're not watching a crazy person, well, maybe you are, but you're also watching the latest output of a machine that learned 50 years ago how to take religious energy and route it through legal shops, donor networks, media ecosystems, and staffing pipelines until it pinches out logs of policy out the other end. And that brings me to the part that actually makes me scared and keeps me up at night. In 2022, 3 political scientists named Miles Armley, David Buckley, and Adam Enders published a study in the journal Political Behavior. They wanted to know why Christian nationalism predicted support for political violence in some people but not others. Because that's the really weird thing about the data. Christian nationalism on its own is actually a very weak predictor. You could score very high on the PRRI scale and still think that political violence is wrong. So what was different about the people who scored high on Christian nationalism and thought the Capitol riot was justified? The answer is a combination that the researchers described like a switchboard. So imagine an old telephone switchboard, a bunch of plugs, a bunch of sockets. Christian nationalism is just one plug, but it only lights up support for violence when you also connect it to 3 other circuits: strong white racial identity, high perceived victimhood, and support for QAnon. At low levels of those 3 things, cranking up Christian nationalism doesn't really move the needle on violence, but if you have a high level of all 3 of them, the same increase in Christian nationalism corresponds to a much steeper jump towards thinking that political violence is acceptable. So, Christian nationalism provides the raw material, the sense that America is a divinely ordained Christian nation, and that its people are chosen, that its enemies are spiritual threats. So that energy is sitting in the system, but the energy is latent until somebody routes it. And the routing happens through those 3 other circuits. White identity tells you who the real Americans are. Victimhood tells you that you're under attack. And QAnon tells you that the attackers are literally satanic pedophiles running the government. When all 4 circuits are live, you get a very specific person. Somebody who believes that God chose their nation. Someone who believes that God chose their nation, that their race is the nation's core, and that they're being persecuted. On top of that, the persecutions are part of a demonic conspiracy. For that person, violence is not that extreme. It just feels like self-defense on behalf of literal God, the boss of the universe from his perspective. Armley, Buckley, and Enders found that about 6% of white respondents and 11.5% of white evangelicals scored in the top quartile of all 4 measures simultaneously. That's a small percentage, but that small percentage represents millions of people. And here's the part that turns the switchboard from an academic model into something that you can watch operating in real time. Someone has to tell the base that they are under attack. Somebody has to name an enemy. Somebody has to describe the threat in terms that are urgent enough to justify extraordinary measures. And if you look at who's doing that naming, who is telling 40 million people every week that secular liberals are waging a war on Christianity, that immigrants are replacing them, that hidden elites are targeting their children. This is on Fox News, it's on OANN, it's on Newsmax, and beneath those, there's a dense network of Christian talk radio, podcasts, and church-adjacent media that keeps the same story playing on loop. PRRI actually measured this. Among Americans who trust far-right TV outlets like OANN and Newsmax, about 2/3 qualify as Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. Among those who trust Fox News, a slim majority do. Among people who trust mainstream or liberal outlets, the number drops off a cliff. The media correlation goes deeper than belief. The media is the routing mechanism I'm talking about here. It's the thing that takes latent religious identity and connects it to white grievance, victimhood narratives, and conspiratorial thinking in real time. So think about what that means in practice. In a lot of red state communities, the default information diet is Fox at dinner and church on Sunday. Both sources are telling you the same story. Your nation was founded for people like you. It's being stolen by people who aren't like you. And the only thing standing between you and cultural extinction is a strong leader willing to fight. That's the switchboard being wired, nightly, again at 8 o'clock with commercial breaks for gold and survival food. Now, let me show you the pattern that genuinely spooked me when I first saw the data. Remember that little factoid that I mentioned earlier, that the group most committed to Christian nationalism became less enthusiastic about extra-legal violence once their faction controlled the state? The group most opposed to Christian nationalism started feeling more like the system wasn't working for them. So this is the moment in power dynamic, and it's one of the scariest things in the data set. When the movement is out of power, the base gets primed for vigilante energy. When the movement captures the government, that energy doesn't disappear, it just joins the official channels. So you don't need paramilitaries when you have the Pentagon. And you don't need vigilante committees when you have a DOJ task force. You don't need to storm the Capitol when the Heritage Foundation has 13,000 pre-screened resumes ready to staff it for you. This pattern shows up in other countries too, by the way. Comparative political science notes that when authoritarian-aligned movements capture state power, they don't stop the coercion, they just formalize it. The BJP in India didn't eliminate mob violence against Muslims when it took power, it just made sure that the mobs had soft impunity from state violence through officials that just looked the other way. The violence just became semi-official. State and non-state coercion blurred together until you couldn't tell where the government ended and the lynch mob began. Now, I'm not saying that the United States is India. I'm saying that the pattern is documented and that the American version of it is visible right now if you know where to look. Hegseth is purging generals from the military. The DOJ Anti-Christian Bias Task Force, for example. The IRS voluntarily disarming the Johnson Amendment. Those aren't random acts of institutional vandalism. They are a movement that is rerouting the switchboard through the state itself. And it goes deeper than just one administration, because there's a finding from Brooklyn Walker and a team of researchers that complicates the clean story that I've really been telling you right now, and so I want to be a little bit honest about it. Walker found that Christian nationalism works as what she called sacralized in-group protection, which is a bit of a mouthful, but the concept is sharp, so let's just break it down. On explicitly racialized issues, things like reparations, policing, voting access, teaching about structural racism, Christian nationalism pushes white believers and black believers in completely different directions. White Christian nationalists oppose reparations and support restrictive voting rules, while black Christian nationalists support reparations and want expanded voting access. So the same ideology, same survey questions, but opposite answers. They are motivated by the same thing to completely different outcomes, depending entirely on what group is being protected. But on non-racialized issues, abortion for example, the effects converge. White, black, and Latino Christians high in Christian nationalism all move in the same direction on banning abortion. There is actually no daylight between these groups. The ideology stops being a racial shield and starts being a shared moral commitment. This is important because it means that Christian nationalism isn't a whites-only phenomenon, even though its dominant American political expression consistently protects white racial hierarchy. White and black Christians score similarly on baseline Christian nationalism scales. The difference is in which direction the ideology points once it's activated. For white adherents, it sacralizes the defense of white advantage. For black and Latino adherents, it sacralizes the defense of their own communities, or serve as a bid for inclusion in the core American identity. Which means that the switchboard model is even more accurate than it first appeared, because Christian nationalism is just a hub. The direction of the output depends upon where the other circuits are connected. White identity plus victimhood plus conspiratorial thinking produces one outcome, but the same religious energy rerouted through black community solidarity and historical grievance produces a completely different one. The ideology is flexible. The infrastructure running the dominant version of it is not. And that infrastructure, the version backed by Leonard Leo's $1 billion and ADF's legal factory and Heritage's staffing database, that version consistently routes the energy in one direction towards maintaining racial, economic, and social hierarchy through state power while calling it religious freedom. So let's reassemble the whole picture and talk about it again, because we're almost done with the analytical part. So hold on, everybody. We're going to make it, okay? The base layer of the stack is not theology. The base layer is a coalition assembled in the 1970s to defend segregated schools. A donor network grew out of that coalition, and the legal infrastructure in that coalition was built to protect the coalition's interests in court. The media ecosystem then trains the base to feel perpetually under threat. The churches deliver the votes, and every few decades, when the current branding expires, the machine swaps in a new product. It can be abortion, parental rights, anti-Christian bias, whatever really tests well. At the top of the stack in 2026, You're seeing Pete Hegseth reading Psalms at the Pentagon. You see Mahmoud versus Taylor giving parents a religious veto over the curriculum. You see the IRS telling churches to endorse whoever they want. You see 13,000 Heritage Foundation screened applicants filling federal desks. And underneath it all, the same question that the movement has been asking since Green v. Connolly in 1971 remains. Does the government have the right to stop us from discriminating? And their answer has always been no. The sophistication of their operation to enforce that answer has improved considerably over 50 years, but the answer has not changed. And right about now, if you're feeling like this is all pretty bleak, like maybe this machine is too big, too well-funded, too deeply rooted to fight, I do have some numbers for you, and they're surprisingly good. So remember PRRI? We spent a lot of time on the scary part, the 32%, the authoritarianism scores, the political violence numbers, but why don't we go and look at the other side? Adherents and sympathizers make up about 32% of the country. Skeptics and rejectors make up 64%. That's 2 to 1. So, sit with that for a second, because the entire thrust of this, again, extraordinarily long video has been, look how powerful this movement is, and the data says that they are outnumbered 2 to 1. The majority of Americans still think the government should not declare this a Christian nation. The majority here, God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society and said, fuck that. So why does 32% keep winning? Now you already know the answer, because I spent this entire video showing you. They have infrastructure, they have donor networks, a legal factory, a staffing pipeline, a media ecosystem, churches running shadow campaign offices. A third of the country has all of that. The other 2/3 just have the same vibe, a general preference for pluralism that hasn't been converted into an organized power. And really, organizing against an idea instead of for an idea is always going to have limits. So here is how thin the margin actually is. More than a third of Virginia school boards in 2023 were decided by less than 500 votes. Not 500,000, 500. In Oklahoma City, a metropolitan area of over 700,000 people, a recent school board election drew a few hundred voters in total. In Delaware, not a single school board race that year had a higher than 10% turnout. In Newark, New Jersey, school board elections routinely poll 3-4% of eligible voters. There are 82,000 school board members in the United States overseeing decisions for roughly 50 million students. That is the single largest group of elected officials in the country. In 2023, somewhere between 53 and 60% of school board seats on the ballot went uncontested. That's more than half. Nobody even ran against the incumbent. Somebody basically won by default. Meanwhile, nearly 80% of school board members are white, even though the majority of public school students are not. The rooms where public policy gets made look nothing like the classrooms that those policies affect. And a study of 100,000 school board meetings found that the viral screaming matches that you see on the news are actually the exception. Most meetings are quiet, procedural, and most importantly, sparsely attended. In most districts, your school board is governing tens of thousands of kids in front of maybe 10 adults who bothered to show up. That's the scale of the vacuum that the 32% are intentionally walking into. But here's the thing about vacuums. They are very easy to fill. They're begging to be filled. You just have to walk in. Durham, North Carolina in 2022, a stealth slate of 5 Christian right-aligned school board candidates ran under a name designed to sound generic. Better board, better schools, better futures. One of them had traveled to Washington on January 6th, just to get you an idea of who these people are. The slate ran a standard playbook that you're probably familiar with at this point. Anti-CRT, anti-LGBTQ, culture war, all that kind of stuff. Low information, nonpartisan race. The kind of election where name recognition and a nice sounding banner usually will get you pretty much into the office. Local organizers found out who they were. They exposed the slate's politics. They talked to their neighbors. And all 5 candidates lost. Every single one. In the same cycle in New York State, at least 27 of 31 parents' rights candidates that were pushing like book bans and Christian nationalist talking points lost their races. 27 out of 31. A voter in Shenandoah. You know what? I'm just gonna put the text down here because I don't even know how to put some of those consonants together. And I am usually pretty okay with these things. But anyways, a voter in this word salad told reporters that they came out specifically because, quote, we don't want any books banned from the library and we don't want religion in schools. So when the 64% actually walks into the room and fills in the little dot, the unstoppable Christian nationalist wave actually starts losing, in this case, almost all of the races that they ran for. So those aren't like flukes or anything. They are proof of a concept. The math works when people actually, do something about it. So what do you actually do with this knowledge? Well, I'm going to give you 3 things. 3 concrete actions that don't require you to be a lawyer, a politician, or somebody with a lot of free time and money. First of all, find your local school board meeting schedule. Just Google, your county school board meeting schedule, and then write the date down and go one time. You don't have to say anything the first time you go. Just go and see who's there, see who's talking, see what they're voting on, because those rooms are usually empty. And the people who do show up disproportionately shape what your kids learn. These are the people who decide what books get to stay in the library, or whether the school counselor is allowed to support a queer child without calling their parents first. When you go back a second time, though, read one short statement into the record, grounded in fairness and safety and students' freedom to be themselves. You don't need to cite church and state theory. You don't need to sound like you're a constitutional lawyer. Just say what you came to say. It goes on the public record, and it matters more than you think. And the part that actually builds power comes after that. Find the 2 or 3 other people in that room who clearly disagree with the Christian nationalist bloc. Then go talk to them after the meeting. Get their phone numbers, start a group text, an email list, a Discord server, whatever. But connect them to each other, because the 32% already has that infrastructure. They have phone trees and small groups and church networks that have been organizing for decades. So you're going to need your own version of that, and it starts really with just 4 people in a parking lot after a Tuesday night school board meeting. Second, we're going to need to put money and attention behind the organizations that are fighting this in court. I know that, donate to organizations sounds like the most useless advice on earth, so I'm going to name some specific ones because, saying support organizations without names is most often a thing that people just like to say when they want to give you an action item, but they don't actually have one. So a few groups that you can look into are Americans United for Separation of Church and State. It has an 80-year track record. They litigate church-state cases, and they explicitly frame their work as the cure for what this video has been describing. They're fighting in the schools right now. The ACLU also has a religious liberty program. They protect both the freedom of religion and freedom from government-imposed religion, both sides of the same coin. You can also look into Lambda Legal. They are the ones fighting every time religious freedom gets weaponized as a license to discriminate against queer people. They briefed Masterpiece Cake Shop. They fought the Mahmoud case. They are going after the precedents that have been set up about conversion therapy. And then there are the organizations that are specifically useful because they represent religious opponents to Christian nationalism. Some examples would be the Interfaith Alliance, the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, the Sikh Coalition. These groups co-chair something that is called the Coalition for Religious Freedom in Public Schools, which are actively organizing against school chaplain bills and religious indoctrination in classrooms. They're not household names. That's actually part of the problem we're trying to deal with here. The Alliance Defending Freedom has $100 million a year in a network of 3,000 lawyers. The organizations that I just named relative to that are drastically outgunned. So every dollar that you spend helps them buy more than $1's worth of influence because they're really punching above their weight just by showing up. And if you want to track something that's happening in your state, Future Ed at Georgetown University maintains a legislative tracker of parental rights bills that are mapping which states have introduced, passed, or defeated them. So if you Google Future Ed Parental Rights Legislative Tracker, you get a free thing to follow that's updated regularly. Now, third, this is the one that costs nothing and might be the most important. I've been thinking about how to phrase this basically for weeks, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. You need to learn to explain all of this in 3 sentences that you can say to a relative or a coworker or somebody at the barbecue who says, I don't see what the big deal is. They're just Christians who love their country. So here are your 3 sentences. You can practice, modify them, make them yours, but have them ready. Basically distilling everything in this video down to like 3 things. So first, Christian nationalism has a third of the country behind it, and they have a legal army, a billion-dollar donor network, and the IRS just effectively let churches openly endorse candidates. Second would be, the whole movement started when conservative leaders lost the fight to keep black kids out of Christian schools on the taxpayers' dime. Then they rebranded around abortion to rebuild that coalition that they had lost. And then mention that the branding keeps changing. Segregation, abortion, parental rights, this infrastructure keeps just finding new culture wars to keep the function the same. So it's a bit of like, portable ammunition, 3 sentences that compress an hour or however the hell long this video is into something that you could deploy at any dinner table. If the person that you're talking to engages, you've got the whole system mapped to walk them through. If they don't, though, oftentimes these big changes in ideas are made of many, many, many interactions. So maybe in this case, you'll have planted a seed that will sprout the next time that they see a headline about a school board fight or a Supreme Court case about religious opt-outs. Now, I've been telling you this entire video that you really can't fight what you can't see, but you can see it now. You can see the donor layer. You can see the man who runs the billion-dollar political operation out of a UPS store. You can see the legal factory and the executive machinery and the church-to-campaign pipeline that the IRS just gave a permission slip. You can see the mass base and what they're willing to tell a stranger with a clipboard. And you can see the foundation, a coalition built 50 years ago to defend segregated schools that merely swaps products every single time the old brand expires. You know the stack, and the stack has a weakness that a diffuse movement does not. Stacks are modular. You can pull pieces out. An ADF test case that gets beaten back pulls a brick out of the legal layer. A school board election where organized students show up puts a crack in that base. None of these alone topples the entire thing, but all of them together, sustained over years, starve a machine of the oxygen that it needs. The 32% understand this. They have been pulling bricks out of the wall between church and state for 50 years. They are patient, they play long games, and they have been extremely successful. The 64% has the numbers. What they've been missing is a map. And now you have that map. I said at the beginning of this video that I was going to show you the machine, and I did. I said, though, that I was also going to show you the exits, and now I have done that too. The last thing that I want to say is the most honest thing that I can say about where we are. I don't know if the 64% is going to organize. I don't know if the latent majority is going to become an active one. The research says that skeptics and rejectors agree on things like pluralism and democracy, but they haven't really been studied as a coalition. They share values. Whether they share a willingness to do something about it on a Tuesday night is still an open question. But I do know this. Every time someone has actually bothered to organize against this stuff, when they've knocked on doors in Durham, when they showed up to vote in this place again, when they have funded the lawyers and tracked the bills and put their name on the public record, it works. Remember, 27 out of 31 of them lost. And then in the other case, all 5 of them lost. Every time the room fills up, the math does what the math does. So you can't fight what you can't see. and now you can see it. What you do with that is up to you. But the room is waiting, and right now, it's mostly empty. So that's the machine, that's the map, and I spent an unreasonable amount of your life showing it to you, so I'm just gonna be honest about a few things that I didn't cover. I didn't talk about Christian Zionism and the prophecy, like biblical prophecy pipeline that feeds US foreign policy. I didn't talk about how this exact playbook exports itself to 6 continents through missionary logistics networks. I didn't get into the psychological research on what happens when a movement like this captures state power and the thermostat breaks. Those are going to have to be their own videos, and you got to tell me if you want them. But if you want to see what happens when this permission structure reaches the street level, when the courts and the media and the ideology all line up to tell one person their violence was justified, I already made that video. It's about Kyle Rittenhouse, and it's here in the description. It's somewhere. This is where the alarm stops being controlled for me. Hegseth isn't an abstraction. He is a man with crusader tattoos running the largest military on Earth during a war, praying for violence on camera. I could see him consolidating power the way military leaders have before, and what comes after that is something that I don't have an analytical frame for. I just have fear. So, everything you watched is just the beginning. If this video did its job, you're sitting there with a map in your head about this whole system that you didn't have at the beginning. You can see the stack, you know the genealogy, you know the names, and that's good. This map is yours now, and you have to use it. But a map is only as good as the person reading it, and the reason I do this, the reason I spent months on these things instead of doing literally anything else with my finite time on Earth, is because I think that you're the person who actually will. You'll go to the school board meeting, you'll have the conversation, you'll send someone the 3 sentences and then field the awkward follow-up questions at dinner. I make these videos on Patreon and Nebula. That's what lets me spend 3 months buried in PRIs, data sets, and IRS court filings instead of making content about, I don't know, whatever the algorithm wants this week. If this gave you something that you can carry into the world, patreon.com/stepbackhistory is where you can make sure the next one happens. The newsletter, The Commons, lives there too. There's a free tier that gets you 1 issue a month and a paid tier that gets you a 2nd issue every month. So if you pay even $1 a month, or I think if you do for a year, it's even less than $1 a month, you get twice the newsletter. It includes stuff like stuff that gets too weird or granular for YouTube, or articles, or there's a lot of different things. Comes out on Thursdays. And of course, I'm contractually obligated to say like and subscribe, to ask you to hit a button so a computer decides to show this to more people. So do that. The computer is fickle, and I am at its mercy. And I'll see you on the next one.